So I'll kind of explain here in a couple minutes how we're going to break up part one, part two. That way you can kind of decide whether part two would make sense for you to come, because you don't necessarily have to go to part two, but it's going to be a little bit different content and a little bit more specific. But I'm going to let Ben introduce himself, then I will introduce myself, and then we will jump in here.
So my name is Ben Pontius. Andy and I work together for an organization called Elementum, and we love helping churches do college and young adult ministry, particularly this part of the process, starting something new. So I got connected, started doing this work, started a college/young adult ministry in Fargo, North Dakota, which is where I currently live. So I'm a long ways away from home. And stayed connected with Andy. Andy kind of coached us through the process of starting the ministry, and then ended up coming up on staff with Elementum several years ago to do what we do full time, which has been a ton of fun. So I've got 3 kids, been married almost 12 years. What else? That's probably all you need to know. If you want to know more about me, you can ask me afterwards. Yeah, I'll turn it back to you.
My name is Andy Abramson, and I live in Austin, Texas. We've been there for the last 6 years. I was trying to think the other day, I've been doing, this summer will be 26 years of doing college and young adult ministry, which is really fun to think how fast that's gone since I've been a young 20-something doing it. I have 5 kids. 2 of them are in college, twin girls. One of them's at the Azusa Pacific in Southern California. Twin sister is in Orlando, Florida. So we have them on the opposite sides of the country, which makes it really interesting. I have a daughter who is a senior. She's going to be graduating, won't be going to school right away. She's actually graduating with her real estate license and her piloting license. And so she's working on becoming a commercial pilot, so which is pretty wild that she can do that as, not kind of slacking. Yeah, I know. I'm like, please fly me around. So we really enjoy, we started Elementum in 2010, so this will be almost 12 years we've been doing this, working with churches. Had the opportunity to work with hundreds of churches around the country, which has been really fun to be in spaces like this. I've been doing Roundup, I think, for 5 or 6 years now, helping Mitch do this, and it's always a great honor to be in spaces like this. So here's what I want to do is let me kind of give you a quick overview of how we're going to structure part 1, part 2. Then I want to kind of get a read on the room a little bit, and then we'll jump in to some of our conversation today. So here's how we're going to structure part 1, part 2. Part 1 is going to be kind of some high-level overview of starting a college ministry. We're going to talk to you about some of the kind of big principles, some of the things to think about. Part 2 is going to be more of like the tactics of it. So we have a whole process that we walk through with churches that usually takes about 12 to 18 months. And we're just going to kind of walk through each of those steps, some of the assignments we give them, some of the things that we would encourage them to do at that stage. So it's going to be the more practical, but you're going to get a lot of great content on kind of the overview. So you might say, hey, I'm good at that point. Or you want to come back this afternoon, we'll go into the more of the practice of starting a college ministry. Okay. So let's do this. How many of you would say you feel like you're kind of restarting a college ministry? So you maybe have a little bit of something, but feel like not a whole lot going on. A couple people. How many of you would say you're kind of starting from scratch? You really don't have anything? Okay, cool. How many of you just couldn't find a breakout, and so you're just like, well, our college ministry is killing it, but I'm just going to sit in the quiet room because it looks pretty comfortable? Anybody? No. How many of you would be kind of more college and young adults? So it'd be kind of like 20-somethings. Yeah. How about college specific, campus? Yeah. Okay, cool. Awesome. Sweet. So here's what I want to do for the next couple minutes is I want to talk to you a little bit about 2 major problems that we see when starting a college ministry. And these would be kind of, the way I'll describe it is when I'm on a call, and I do probably 100+ calls a year with different leaders. Some of those are pastors, some of those are volunteers, just to kind of talk through their ministry a little bit. And there's kind of 2 buckets where I see a lot of people kind of falling down. Number one is they're very random in building a ministry. And so what I mean by that is they're not thinking sequentially about the steps that they need to take, and they're just all over the board trying, closing their eyes, throwing things at a wall, and then hoping that they would stick. The term that we use quite a bit is called ministry sequence. And ministry sequence is the sequential process of building a ministry. The example I always use, and you'll see this a couple different spots today, is we talk about this idea of building a house. We're in the process right now of getting ready to build a house. And so if Ben and I are in a conversation and Ben's like, okay, like tell me your plan, for building your house. And I'm like, okay, Ben, here's what I'm going to do first. First, I'm going to build the roof. Then I'm going to paint the kitchen. Then I'm going to clear cut the ground. Then I'm going to put the walls. You look at me and think, bro, you're an idiot. Those are the individual components of building a house, but there's a certain kind of order that you put the house in. We do ministry a lot of that same way. We kind of work on a little bit of the roof, and then we jump over to painting the kitchen, and then we wonder why there's no momentum. And really, when we talk about this idea of ministry sequence, it's saying, what stage of ministry are you in? Right? And what are the 2 or 3 most important things that you need to focus on right now? Right? And kind of almost put blinders on and not be distracted when you go to a conference of like, yeah, but Drew Dabbs is doing this, or, Chris Cummings is doing this. And I was saying, no, this is the stage we're in. This is what we're working on. This is what we're building, because if we know we are here and can do that, then we'll get there. Then we'll get there. Then we'll get there, and thinking through sequentially. So that's kind of one of the big pitfalls that we see within ministry. The other one is what we call copy and paste ministry, right? And it's a temptation to sit in a room in a conference like this, hear what somebody else is doing, or look at what the church down the road is doing and just say, that's what we got to try to replicate. Like, they have a band, they have a speaker, they do mission trips to campus, they do, like, you can fill in the blank to whatever that looks like. If we can just do what they do, then it will equate us being successful in ministry as well. And so we'll try to copy and paste what somebody else is doing. Or, honestly, for those of us who are a little bit older in the room, we copy and paste what we experienced in college ministry. Well, we used to do it this way, or when I was in college, this is the way that we did it. And so you try to replicate something that you experienced maybe, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago or whatever. And so that's what I would say is like a couple of the major kind of problems that we're dealing with. And I really want you to kind of step back a little bit today and begin to say, okay, like, how do I think creatively about how God is calling us to build a ministry, maybe redefine what ministry looks like, and to begin to take some steps forward here today. So I'll turn over to Ben.
So really, one of the problems with the copy and paste method of ministry is that it is copying the tactics that someone else is doing. So we'll talk with leaders about the difference between a strategy and tactics. A strategy would be things like, so for college ministry, if you're campus specific, a strategy that most campus ministries have is, let's reach the freshmen. Right. That's a strategy. You can do that. There's a whole lot of different ways. Reaching new freshmen is a key strategy if you're a campus ministry. Now, the way that plays out is the tactical side of things. And this is the challenge. People will say, okay, we see this ministry over here is doing this tactic. So they want to reach freshmen, and they're doing, they're spending several $1,000s setting up this sweet giveaway and all this stuff, and they're reaching thousands of freshmen, and they're getting all these names, and they're doing phone follow-ups and one-on-one meetings and stuff. And you're there at the church of 200, and you're like, my budget is $25, and I have one student who's super awkward, and they're never going to do those follow-up phone calls. And the temptation is to be like, oh, well, we got to do what they're doing. We got to copy their tactic. That's not necessarily the case. There are other ways to achieve that strategy, to follow that strategy of reaching new freshmen that don't require you to steal someone else's tactics. Now, you can learn from other people's tactics, but so this is a key thing. We need to differentiate these two things and say, what's the strategy? What's the goal that we need to achieve? And then based on how God has wired us as individuals, the gifts, the strengths, the capacities, the resources that we have in our church and the needs and opportunities in our context, then we figure out what the tactics are instead of copying and pasting other people's tactics into our context. And that's a really important thing. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, cool. So here's 4 more mistakes that we see churches making. Andy talked about 2 problems. Let's move those problems off the table. And here's some mistakes that we'll see. One is not evaluating readiness, right? If you are saying, man, our church wants to launch a campus ministry or a young adult ministry, we'll talk with leaders in churches who say, man, we want something to reach young adults, and ask them some questions like, hey, do you have any college students at your church? Is your church a welcoming place for 20-somethings? Or do you have someone who wants to take on kind of a key role in making that happen? And if a lot of those things are missing, they might not be ready to launch a ministry. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't pursue launching a college ministry or launching a young adult ministry. It just means there's some foundational things that are missing, some pre-work that needs to be done before we think about launching a ministry. So that's number one. The readiness might include things like, hey, are we willing to, do we have resources? Are we willing to put resources behind this thing? Do we have a vision or a sense of here's what it would look like for our church to more effectively reach college students and young adults? Number 2, there's not having a specific leader. One of the things I'm really passionate about is team leadership. I don't think there should be solo leaders, but that does not mean you don't have someone who's on point, who's the point leader. They're going to take the initiative. They're going to make things happen. They feel the weight and the sense of responsibility for the thing. Now, I don't think that should be done by one person. Sometimes that's what it looks like. Just the reality of the context you might be ministering in means you're the person who's doing it for now. But 2 years from now, it shouldn't be just you. If it is just you, that's a breakdown in some of the things that you're doing. But if you don't have a specific leader, nothing's going to happen. And we've seen churches say, we want to start something, and we have these 6 people who are interested in something happening. We got these 6 college students, but none of them want to take the role of point leader. It's probably not going to go very far. You need someone who's willing to take that point role. Now, that does not necessarily mean they're going to be the person to lead it for all time. It might mean that they're there for 6 months, get things up and running, and then they transition out, which is the reality of the stage of life. So number 2 is not having a specific leader. Number 3 is not doing the work of laying a solid foundation. We'll talk about this more in a little bit. But a lot of times we rush to launching something. We want to have a campus ministry, so we're going to start we're going to become a campus organization, and we're going to start a worship service on campus. Or we want to reach the young adults in our city, so we're going to start a young adult midweek Bible study. But we haven't done any of the work to prepare and make sure that that's actually what is going to achieve the mission of making disciples of Jesus among that demographic. Again, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Last one, this is just kind of reiterating something we already touched on, doing copy and paste ministry, just taking what worked elsewhere and putting it here. And we reiterate this one consistently because this is probably one of the number one issues that we see working with leaders is they say, this is how they're doing it. We're going to do that here. It worked there, therefore it must work here. And again, that's going back to the strategy versus the tactics. You can copy and paste all the tactics you want, and it's only going to work to the extent that you are the leader that person is, and your context is the context that their context is. So those are four breakdowns. Andy's going to talk through a really helpful kind of framework for thinking about disciple making that is absolutely crucial for you to understand, I think, before you dive into launching something.
Yeah, so this is a framework that we utilize with a lot of our leaders called upper room, lower room. And it's just kind of a good conversation, and it's a good kind of starting point to think about ministry and what needs to be built and the different pieces that need to be built along the way. And so I'm going to build a kind of a house here. And in this house, I'm going to have 2 different levels. And on the upper level, we're going to call this the upper room. And on the lower, this is the lower room.
Makes sense.
Okay? Up is up, low is down, right? Okay? So here's the question. So here's we'll say this is campus or a city. You have these college students or these young adults. The question is what is going to bring them into the orb of your ministry, right? Like, what are those kind of key things that draw people in? In this framework what we talk about is the 4 Ps. The 4 Ps are what we consider initial factors that will pull somebody into a ministry, okay? Number 1 is we talk about this idea that place can become a factor that draws somebody into a ministry, right? And you can kind of define place in 2 different ways. It can be sometimes in maybe a little bit different congregations. It can be like the aesthetics, kind of how cool the room is a drawing factor. But for a lot of like college ministry, it can be like proximity is a drawing factor. So how close that the ministry is to where the student resides. So I'll give you an example. So one of the Breakout leaders here, Chris Cummings, we've been working with him for the last 3 or 4 years now. He just moved this winter to Tucson, Arizona. They're going to be planting a church next to the University of Arizona in Tucson. My wife and I went out and spent 2 days with him and Kristen, and they were showing us around Tucson, all the kind of spots where college students are at, showed us the football field, walked through campus. And on the last day, he's kind of driving us around the perimeter of the campus. And he shows me a middle school, and he says, "That's the spot." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "That is the perfect spot for us to put our church plant." He said, so here's the middle school, and then if you look right across the street is one of the biggest student common areas where students hang out, along with like 3 of the biggest dorms that are on the campus are right across the street from this middle school. And he said, "Man, if we had church there, the place would be so ideal in proximity to where the students are at, where they could literally get out of bed, hang out, walk across the street, and be at the middle school." So place can become a factor to why a student would come into the orb of your ministry. Number 2, the second P is programs, right? So there can be students, young adults, that are attracted or come initially into your ministry because of a program that you have. And they have Sunday school. They play ultimate frisbee in the common area on Thursday nights. Fill in the blank. Like, there's a program that is an initial drawing point to a student coming into the orb of the ministry. Number 3, the third P is personality. And the way we define personality is kind of the attractiveness of key leaders in your ministry. So, man, the lady who leads our small group, I love her, right? Or, man, that guy's a great speaker. I love the way he opens up the Word of God. Or, man, that worship leader is incredible. Like, so there's kind of this like draw to the personality of a person who's in key leadership within the ministry that can become a drawing factor. And then the last one, and this would probably be the biggest P, which is people, right? So I go to the college ministry because my roommate Sarah invited me to the college ministry. Or my coworker John invited me to Ultimate Frisbee Night, or fill in the blank. That the people are the driving factors. And so for a lot of students, these 3 Ps become the reason at why they initially come into the ministry. Right? Could be a place, could be programs, could be personality, could be people. Now, here's the challenge in ministry. Can we give them something more than the lower room of ministry, and can we help move them and begin to move them into the upper room? And here's what the upper room is. It's really around this vision of disciple making. And what I mean by that is, and I want to kind of expand on that a little bit, is to be so overwhelmed and captured by the love of God that they want to pour their life into the mission of God and to turn around and make disciples. All right, so can we move students beyond place, beyond program, beyond personality, beyond people, and to begin to move them into the upper room of ministry, which is really around a vision of disciple making. Now, here's what we learned during COVID. Not just college ministry, but churches. Because this is the reason that even adults will come into the church. But what happens if the reason that you come is place, programs, personality, people, and that equation changes, and you're only functioning in the lower room? What we found during COVID was people leave, right? So if you became, because there was a place, and now the place you no longer can meet there, or in a different scenario, maybe the church moves 4 blocks, 7 blocks, 10 blocks away. Now it's not as close as it used to be. And now, I don't know if I want to go there anymore. Or, man, we used to do Ultimate Frisbee on Thursday nights, and they don't do Ultimate Frisbee on Thursday nights anymore. And so now, because that program is no longer there, now it's like, well, I don't know if I want to go to the college ministry anymore. Or, man, the guy who used to lead worship, man, I loved him. The new guy, not so good, you know? And all of a sudden it's like the personality no longer attracts him anymore. Or, hey, Sarah, my roommate, graduated and she moved to San Antonio and no longer goes to the college ministry. And so I just don't feel as connected anymore. And the reason that that happens is because we have allowed people just to stay in the lower room of ministry and have never moved them into the upper room. And so here's what I want to encourage you, and what we're going to encourage you through the rest of our time today as we begin to, this afternoon, kind of walk through a process is, my argument is we need to do both, right? We need to have some kind of structure of lower rooms, of saying place, programs, personality, people. Yes, those things are important. But if that's all that your ministry is, and you never develop an upper room of ministry, the moment the equation changes for somebody who came, they're going to leave. The moment you leave, everything falls apart. And so I want to talk to you, and this is what we're going to talk about this afternoon. There's really kind of 3 steps that we see in building the upper room. Number 1, and you'll hear this in a few minutes, we want to get the leader in the upper room. You'd be surprised how many pastors, leaders I talk to who have never experienced or never caught a vision of disciple making. They have only functioned in their ministry in the lower room, right? So what we want to do is say, hey, there's something more to ministry, and we want you to experience that. We want you to catch a vision of disciple making, to understand the mission of God, and so we want to get that leader. Secondly, we want to begin to move and to get really a team of people in the upper room. And so now this leader is going down and actually bringing other people up into the upper room to experience a vision beyond just lower room activities. And then number 3 is we want to begin to think about systems. And it's really about this idea of, man, what if we actually created a staircase that we could help people move into the upper room? But to do that, we need to get the leader in the upper room. That leader needs to begin to invite other key members into the upper room. And then ultimately, we're going to push towards building a system. So one of the things that we would advocate for is really, this becomes easy for us. And a lot of you are sitting in the room because of these things. Well, tell me the place to meet, right? Tell me the program I should run. Tell me, like what my personality, whatever. Like those are the reasons of why we're here. But I want to make sure that we're not just hanging here, and also developing a deeper, wider, stronger ministry where we're pulling people into something greater of mission, that no matter when they leave your ministry, that they will be captured by this, that ultimately they will take those things and begin to move them forward. Does that make sense? Any questions on that or thoughts on that? That's kind of a framework that we use with a lot of churches to kind of help them balance the structure and organization of ministry, also with this upper room of a vision for disciple making.
Just one comment on this. I think the tendency, Andy kind of mentioned this, but the tendency to say, oh, we want to start a college ministry, right? That's the name. Starting a college ministry is the name of this Breakout. We assume the default, most people, like Andy said, is you're thinking about this. How do we get more students at our Sunday school? We want more people in this place for this program. How do we get more young adults in our midweek Bible study that we do at our pastor's home or whatever. And what I'm going to say in just a few minutes here is that this is not the place to start. Like Andy was saying, these are things you're going to develop, and they're valuable. They're important. Like Jesus had all these lower room things, but this is not the place Jesus starts his ministry. He starts with himself, right? Obviously, he has a heart for the vision of disciple making. He has a heart of his Father. He said, I'm reading through the Gospel of John with a few guys currently, and over again, right? Jesus says, I only do what I see the Father doing. I only say what I hear the Father saying. And people are consistently confused and angered by him saying stuff like that. So what we're going to say here is this is where you need to start. These things will come as you do these things. And what you do here will become clear once this is in place, once you have a clear vision of disciple making. So why don't you go to the next one?
Is it the steps?
Yes. Yeah. So here's a question for you guys. We're going to we're using the same metaphor of building a house in multiple ways, like Andy said earlier. If you were buying a plot of land, right? Andy gave the metaphor earlier. If he was going to build a house, he was going to buy the roof and stuff first. That'd be silly. If you bought a plot of land and we're building a house, what's the first step you need to do? You've got your land, you want to build the house. What's the first step? That's what most people say. But it's probably not the first step. Because before you can build a foundation, you need to make sure the ground's level. You probably need to survey the ground and make sure it's not swampy. There may be some big rocks you got to move out of the way. You may have to clear cut some trees. So when we talk about the first stage, we call this stage 0 of starting a college ministry. It is about preparing the ground. Most people assume if I'm going to build a house, I build the foundation. That's stage 1. If you are starting from scratch and don't have anything, you're not at stage 1. You're at stage 0. You need to prepare the ground. And these are the 4 steps that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to give you a brief overview, kind of like 60-second snapshot of each one of these. I guess realistically, I may do more than 60 seconds, but we're going to dive deeper into each one of these this afternoon and talk through here's practically how you can implement some of this stuff. But step number 1, this is, I'd say, the most important, and I say it's the most important because it is one of the ones that is skipped most frequently by people who are starting a ministry. Discern your context. What we mean by that is you need to know the context that God has placed you in. You need to know general data about it. You need to know the stories that people are telling in that context. What are the struggles, the issues that they're facing? What's the pain? This afternoon we'll talk about some more P's. We've got 4 P's here. There'll be 5 P's or maybe 6 this afternoon that are helpful for questions to ask about your context. So you need to know the context that you're coming into, right? If I live in Fargo, North Dakota, very different context than Dallas-Fort Worth. The weather is significantly different, and that alone is enough to change how I need to do ministry, right? The ministry that I can do in the summertime in Fargo, North Dakota is very different than the ministry I can do in wintertime in Fargo, North Dakota, because we do summer grill outs was a consistent thing for a bunch of years, and we would get 80 to 100 people on a regular weeknight. Wintertime, we can't do grill outs because it's negative 32 degrees in the winter. And that's not an exaggeration. That's a normal thing. So know your context. A couple things that might look like. And again, we'll dig deeper into this afternoon. You should know demographic data. How many college students are on the campus you want to reach? How many young adults are in your city? There are really easy ways to find that out. One resource is datausa.io. It's a website where you can go type in your city name, type in your campus name, and it'll give you some basic demographic data. So datausa.io. We'll talk more about some tools for that this afternoon. Step number 2, disciple-making basics. So these two, the next two, are really what Andy was talking about here, is getting you as a leader into that upper room where you have a vision and a heart for disciple-making. The tendency in the church world, many of the leaders that we talk with, their vision of disciple-making is functionally getting students to a Bible study. If I get them to a Bible study, or if I get them to this class, I'm discipling them. Now, that may be a part of discipleship, but it's not the entirety of discipleship. You read through the Gospels and look at Jesus' method of disciple making. It is so much more than an education model. Yes, information transfer is important, but there's also the context of relationship. There's also the context of they are on mission together. They're encountering and observing how Jesus interacts with demonized people, with sick people, with crowds of people, with people who are threatening to kill him. That's what discipleship is. It is people being exposed to your life with Jesus, and by that exposure, they're going to have questions, and you're going to be able to answer those questions, right? Here's a principle that I think is so helpful as adults, and I count college students as adults in this statement. Adults learn on a need-to-know basis. You learn stuff when you need to know it, and that might be, I'm in this class, I need to know this information because I'm going to get tested on it. But more commonly in everyday life, the stuff that you remember is stuff that you needed to know. And most of the disciple-making methods we see people using does not follow that. It's giving them information they don't feel a need for. So you look at Jesus' method of discipleship, and he puts his disciples in situations where they're like, oh crap, how do we handle this? We prayed for this demonized boy, and the demon didn't come out, and Jesus comes down off the mountain and is like, well, let me show you how to do this. And he says stuff like, oh, this kind only comes out by fasting and prayer, right? So guarantee his disciples learned that lesson pretty well, because they were like, man, we just got schooled. Like, we thought we knew how to do this, solve this problem, and we realized we don't know how to solve this problem. And then Jesus comes in and demonstrates, here's what this looks like to do that. That's a better picture of disciple making than I'm going to educate you on how to study your Bible. Now, again, that's a key piece of discipleship, but it's not the entirety of discipleship. Last piece, or piece number 3, leadership basics. It's really about, are you living out what you're calling people to live? Again, I'm consistently surprised by how many leaders will talk to, functionally their leadership is running events. Their leading of ministry is, I put on an event for students to attend or for young adults to attend, rather than I live the mission. Like, here's a question to ask yourself. Particularly if you're in vocational ministry, how many friends do you have that are not Christians? And I don't mean like how many acquaintances do you have that your neighbor that you wave at as you drive out. Like, how many actual friends do you have? Like, people who you hang out with and have fun with who are not Christians. Because if you're calling your students to make disciples and you don't have friends who aren't Christians, it's not going to work. Right? There's a reason that Jesus was labeled as the friend of sinners, because he had sinners who were his friends. So particularly if you're in vocational ministry, this is a challenging one. Saying, man, am I living what I want to see the people I'm leading living? If you're not doing that, you're not going to lead them into what you want to lead them into. You can label the mission all you want, but if you're not embodying it and living it out, it's not going to work. Here's a key thing that I want to point out. All these things happen before you start something. So from the outside perspective, so start something simple. Now we're moving into this piece. Now we're establishing something, call it more formal ministry, something that's like officially happening. These things are all foundational work. You're preparing the ground for starting something. From the outside perspective, most people would see you doing these things, learning about disciple making, beginning maybe meeting one-on-one with a student or two, making sure your life is aligning with the mission that you're calling your people to. They're going to look at those things and probably be like, man, there's not a whole lot going on there. We don't have a college ministry yet. Where are the students? Where are the young adults? They're not showing up on Sunday. We wanted to have a worship service on Sunday night where there was going to be 40 or 50 young adults, and they're not there. This stuff all precedes the starting something. And that's a key point. And the last piece I want to say about this one is it's about starting something simple. it needs to look like what you are capable of as a leader, not the copying and pasting what works somewhere else. So for some ministries, some contexts, that might look like starting something simple might be, I have the 4 college students who go to our church over once a week, and we have dinner and do a Bible study. And that's an awesome place to start. That might look like, we're going to start with a game night. We had our ministry in Fargo. We had a group that they realized that there were 3 people who are a part of our ministry that were all living in the same apartment complex. And they're like, man, we could totally start something in our apartment complex. And what that looked like, rather than being like, man, we're going to do like this big evangelistic push, we're going to door knock and, or start a worship service next in the like community room or whatever. What they landed on was they discerned their context. They were all pretty well grounded in some disciple making basics, and they were living that stuff out in other contexts. They said, here's what we're going to do. We all live here. So let's just, as we pass our neighbors, let's invite them to every other week board game night. We'll just have open apartment, come over, we'll provide you dinner, and you can hang out and play board games. And they did that for, it was probably 1.5 to 2 years. Had just some really cool stuff happen out of that. About half of the group that came regularly were not Christians, about half were Christians. And they started out of that, starting some discipleship groups as they got to know people and other stuff. So they started something simple. It was low overhead, and they are all like, this, we would do this anyways. Like this, we'd be more than happy for the 3 of us to get together and do a board game night. So let's just open it up to more people beyond our immediate kind of default context. So starting something simple says, what are you capable of? Another question you ask, what would be fun for you? If your ministry is like consistently draining you, you're probably doing it wrong. Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be times where you're like, man, this is a slog and it's really difficult. But if you're consistently like, I do not enjoy this thing, that's probably a sign that either you haven't done some of this work, or the thing you're trying to create is not what you should be trying to create based on your giftings, your skills, your context. Like we already said, this afternoon, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each one of these 4 and talk through practically what are some tools, tips, and stuff that we walk leaders through.